The bunny woman who asked me for cooking lessons. Sterling sat on his porch on the planet Navara, watching the wind rustle through the blue-leaf trees. The sky was a pale violet, clear of any clouds, and for a moment he believed the peace of his retirement was finally real. He had spent 20 years in the Galactic Fleet Culinary Division, a career defined by the roar of plasma burners and the frantic energy of feeding thousands of soldiers during deep space maneuvers. Now, his only responsibility was to himself, and the small garden of terrestrial herbs he was trying to coax out of the alien soil. The silence lasted exactly 4 minutes. A piercing, rhythmic shriek tore through the air, coming from the cottage next door. It was the unmistakable sound of a high-end smoke alarm. Sterling stood up, his knees popping with a reminder of his age, and looked toward the neighboring porch. Thick, gray smoke began to billow from an open window, smelling of charred sugar and something that might have once been a vegetable. He did not hesitate. He crossed the short distance between their properties in a few long strides. He reached the door and found it unlocked, the handle warm to the touch. He shoved it open and was immediately met by a wall of haze. "Clementine, get out of there," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a chief petty officer. Through the smoke, he saw a slender figure frantically waving a floral dish towel at a pot on the induction stove. Clementine, his Leporan neighbor, was a blur of white fur and panic. Her long, velvet ears were pinned back against her head, and her wide blue eyes were watering from the fumes. She did not stop her frantic waving even as he approached. "It will not go out," she cried, her voice high and strained. "I followed the instructions, Sterling. I followed them exactly." Sterling reached past her, his hand moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had survived 3 galley fires. He gripped the dial of the induction burner and clicked it firmly to the off position. He grabbed a heavy lid from the counter and slammed it onto the smoking pot, cutting off the oxygen. The hissing sound died instantly, leaving only the dying scream of the smoke alarm. He reached up and tapped the reset button on the ceiling unit with the end of a wooden spoon he found on the counter. Silence returned to the kitchen, heavy and smelling of ruin. Sterling stepped back and waved a hand to clear the air. Clementine stood by the counter, her floral dress dusted with ash and the tips of her white fur singed a light brown. She looked down at the covered pot, her ears drooping until they touched her shoulders. "Are you trying to make soup or start a signal fire?" Sterling asked. He kept his tone light, seeing the way her hands trembled. He had known her for 3 months, mostly through polite nods over the fence and the occasional exchange of garden tools. He knew she worked as a cartographer for the planetary government, a job that required immense precision and intelligence. In the kitchen, however, she seemed to be a magnet for disaster. "I just wanted it to be hot enough to cook quickly," she said softly. "The recipe said to bring it to a boil. I thought if I turned the heat to the maximum setting, it would save time." Sterling looked at the induction stove, then back at her. "Soup requires patience, Clementine. It is not a warp drive. You cannot force the flavor to arrive faster by increasing the energy output." She looked at the floor, her whiskers twitching in embarrassment. "I am a failure at this. My sister Bianca says I am the only Leporan in the sector who could burn water. She is coming over for dinner on Friday, and I wanted to prove I could handle a simple broth." Sterling felt a pang of warmth in his chest. He looked around her kitchen. It was clinical and cold, filled with high-tech gadgets that looked like they had never been used. There were no stains on the counters, no smells of garlic or butter, just the lingering scent of the disaster. It reminded him of his own kitchen when he first arrived on Navara, a space that was functional but lacked a soul. "You did not burn the water," he said, lifting the lid of the pot. "You just carbonized the aromatics." He looked at the blackened sludge at the bottom. It was a total loss. He set the pot in the sink and ran cold water over it, the steam rising in a final gasp of failure. "I can help you," he said. Clementine looked up, her blue eyes brightening. "You are a busy man, Sterling. I have seen you in your garden. You value your peace. My peace is currently being threatened by the possibility of you burning down the entire neighborhood, he joked. But more than that, I hate to see good ingredients go to waste. I was a chef for the fleet for a long time. Teaching you the basics of a broth is easier than feeding a destroyer crew during a hull breach. She tilted her head, a classic Leporin gesture of curiosity. You would really do that? Teach me. I would, he replied, on one condition. You stop treating the stove like an enemy combatant. It is a tool, not a weapon. Clementine let out a small, musical laugh that made the tension in the room evaporate. I can try, though the stove and I have a very complicated relationship. Sterling leaned against the counter, observing her. She was elegant in a way that felt accidental. Her species was known for their agility and keen senses, traits that made them excellent navigators and scouts. Seeing her so out of her element in a kitchen was endearing. It broke the professional wall he usually kept between himself and the world. We start tomorrow, Sterling said. I will bring the supplies. We will start with something that cannot explode. I would love that more than anything, she replied, her eyes lighting up with a sudden energetic glow. Thank you, Sterling. He nodded and turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He looked back at her standing in the middle of her smoky kitchen, a small figure against the backdrop of high-tech machinery. And Clementine, he added. Yes. Open a window. The smoke is going to linger if you do not. She flushed a deep pink under her white fur and hurried to the window, her movements fluid and graceful once more. Sterling walked back to his own porch, the violet sky deepening into a rich indigo. He sat back down in his chair and looked at his hands. They were steady, but he could feel a faint pulse of excitement in his fingers that had been missing for years. He thought about Harrison, his old quartermaster, who had retired to a luxury station 3 systems away. Harrison would call him a fool for spending his time teaching a neighbor how to chop onions. You earned your rest, Sterling, Harrison would say in that gravelly voice of his. You cooked for admirals. You do not owe anyone a grilled cheese. But Harrison did not understand the silence of Navarra. He did not understand how a house could feel like a tomb if the only thing cooking in it was a microwave meal for one. Sterling looked at his herb garden. The silver thyme was thriving, its leaves shimmering in the light of the single moon. It was a spice meant for sharing, for lifting the flavor of a heavy stew and bringing people together. Clementine was different from the people he had known in the military. There was no rank with her, no hidden agendas or tactical objectives. She was just a woman who wanted to make a bowl of soup for her sister. There was a purity in that desire that Sterling found himself envying. He stood up and went inside his own house. The air was cool and smelled of dried lavender. He walked into his kitchen and ran his hand over the smooth, stainless steel surface of his prep table. Tomorrow, there would be flour on this table. There would be the sound of a knife rhythmically hitting a cutting board. There would be life. He pulled out a notebook and a pen. He began to list the things they would need: carrots, celery, onions, the holy trinity of the kitchen. He would teach her the importance of a uniform dice, how the size of the vegetable determined the release of its flavor into the water. He found himself smiling as he wrote. It was a small start, a single spark in the quiet of his retirement, but as he closed the notebook, he felt a sense of purpose he had not felt since he hung up his uniform. The bunny woman who asked for cooking lessons had no idea she was actually the one doing the rescuing. He turned off the lights and looked out the window one last time. A soft light was still burning in Clementine's kitchen. He could see her silhouette as she moved about, likely cleaning up the mess they had made. He hoped she was not trying to start a new pot tonight. Tomorrow, they would do it right. He went to bed, the scent of singed fur and burnt carrots still faint in his nose, but for the first time in years, he did not dream of the war. He dreamed of the smell of fresh bread and the sound of someone laughing over a messy stove. He realized his retirement was over, and a much better life was finally beginning. He felt a deep sense of peace as he watched the night sky through the window, two different species bound by the simple, ancient magic of a shared table. The Oakhaven market was a riot of colors and scents that defied the sterile memory of Sterling's shipboard life. He walked with a purpose, his heavy boots clicking against the polished stone floor of the trade hub. Clementine followed close behind, her long ears twitching at every chime and call from the automated vendors. She seemed overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the commerce, her eyes darting from the floating displays to the mountains of produce. Sterling stopped at a stall overflowing with vibrant, glowing tubers. The vendor, a weathered man named Cale, nodded at him with the silent respect shared between locals. Sterling picked up a root, feeling its weight and the slight warmth it emitted from its bioluminescent core. He handed it to Clementine. "This is a sun root," Sterling said. "It provides the base for almost every savory dish on Navarra. Feel the density. If it is soft, the flavor has already fled into the air." Clementine took the root, her small hands nearly disappearing around its girth. "It feels like a warm stone," she said. "It is heavy for something that looks like a flower." She looked at the rows of pungent herbs hanging from the rafters, swaying in the artificial breeze of the ventilation system. "What about those silver ones?" Sterling reached up and plucked a sprig of silver thyme. He crushed a leaf between his thumb and forefinger, releasing a sharp, peppery scent that cut through the sweetness of the market air. He held it out to her. "This one is for heat, and this one is for heart," he said. "It adds a layer of depth that reminds people of where they came from." Clementine leaned in to sniff the herb. Her nose wiggled frantically, a gesture Sterling found increasingly charming. "It smells like rain on a dusty road," she whispered. "It makes me feel like I should be sitting by a fireplace." She reached for a heavy bag of grain on a nearby shelf, her enthusiasm outstripping her coordination. The bag shifted under her touch, threatening to bring down a precarious stack of glass oil bottles. Sterling moved before the first bottle could tilt. He caught her arm with one hand and stabilized the shelf with the other. The strength in his arms was a remnant of years spent hauling crates of heavy rations, but he kept his touch light. "Take it slow," he whispered. "The kitchen does not reward speed if it comes at the cost of the ingredients. A chef is a guardian, not a conqueror." Clementine blushed, her white fur tinged with pink at the tips of her ears. "I am sorry," she said. "I just want to learn everything at once so I do not have to be the girl who almost burned her house down anymore." "We have time," Sterling replied. He felt the warmth of her arm through the thin fabric of her sleeve before he let go. He bought the supplies, paying Cale with a quick tap of his credit chip, and led her back toward his cottage. Inside Sterling's kitchen, the atmosphere was different from the chaos of the previous night. The charred smell was gone, replaced by the clean scent of flour and fresh herbs. He cleared the heavy oak table, a piece he had built himself during his first year of retirement. He set out the grain they had purchased and a bowl of spring water. "Today we make bread," Sterling announced. "It is the foundation of every alliance throughout history. If you can share bread, you can share a life." He showed her how to pour the water, how to add the yeast, and how to wait for the first signs of life in the bowl. He explained the science of it, the way the microscopic organisms woke up and began to breathe. When it was time to knead, he demonstrated the rhythmic push and fold of the dough. His hands moved with a grace that contradicted his scarred knuckles. "Your turn," he said, stepping aside. Clementine dived in with both hands. She was far too vigorous. A cloud of flour billowed up as she slammed her palms into the sticky mass with the force of someone trying to put out a fire. Within seconds, a fine white powder coated the counter, her floral dress, and Sterling's dark shirt. She stopped, a large glob of dough stuck to her right ear and a look of pure horror on her face. Sterling looked at his ruined shirt and then at her. He started to laugh. It was a deep, rusty sound he had not heard from his own throat in years. It felt like a weight was being lifted from his chest. Clementine giggled, seeing that he was not angry. She wiped a streak of white across Sterling's cheek with a floury finger. "I think I am better at the eating part," she admitted. "I am a cartographer, Sterling. I map the stars and the mountains. I am used to things staying where I put them. This dough is like a living creature." The back door creaked open, and Harrison stepped inside. He was a tall man with a permanent scowl that hid a loyal heart. He stopped dead when he saw the state of the kitchen. Harrison had served with Sterling in the logistics division and knew him as a man of absolute order and discipline. "Sterling," Harrison said, his voice flat, "you were the lead culinary officer for the Third Fleet. You once served a 7-course meal to a high chancellor while the ship was under fire from 3 different frigates. Why are you currently covered in bread guts?" Sterling wiped his face with a towel but did not stop smiling. "I am teaching, Harrison. It is a different kind of service." Harrison pulled Sterling toward the mudroom, lowering his voice so the women would not hear. "You are wasting your time," he said. "She is a Leporin. They are cartographers and dreamers. They do not have the temperament for a professional kitchen. They are too flighty. Why are you wasting your retirement on someone who cannot even hold a spoon without causing a disaster?" Sterling looked back into the kitchen. Clementine's sister, Bianca, had just arrived and was helping Clementine pick the dough out of her fur. The 2 women were laughing, their voices bright and musical, filling the corners of the room that had been silent for too long. The kitchen, which had felt like a sterile laboratory for the last 3 years, was suddenly full of life and warmth. "Because she makes the kitchen feel like a home instead of a workplace," Sterling replied. "For the first time, I am not cooking for a rank or a mission. I am cooking for the sake of the meal itself." Harrison sighed and shook his head, though the corners of his mouth twitched. "You always were a soft touch for a lost cause, Sterling. Just do not let her burn the neighborhood down. I like my house where it is." "I have it under control," Sterling said. He felt a surge of confidence. He was not just teaching her to cook, he was learning how to live again. He walked back to the table and picked up a fresh bag of flour. Clementine looked up at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of regret. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Did I make too much of a mess?" "Everything is perfect," Sterling said. He reached out and gently brushed a stray bit of flour from her temple. "Now, let us try that fold again. This time, do not fight the dough. Imagine it is a secret you are trying to keep, not an enemy you are trying to conquer." Clementine smiled and reached for the dough. This time her movements were softer, more deliberate. Sterling stood behind her, guiding her hands with his own. He could feel the steady beat of her heart and the softness of her fur against his skin. He realized that for the first time since leaving the service, he was not looking at the clock. He was not waiting for the day to end so he could return to the silence of his thoughts. Bianca watched them from the doorway, a knowing look on her face. "You are a good teacher, Sterling," she said. "Most people just give up on her after the first explosion. She has a way of making things complicated." "She is worth the effort," Sterling said, his voice firm. Clementine's ears perked up at the comment. She did not look away from the dough, but the rhythm of her kneading became steady and sure. The sun began to dip toward the horizon of Navarra, casting long, golden shadows across the wooden floor. The house felt warm, filled with the promise of fresh bread and the comfort of company. For Sterling, the long, cold silence of retirement was finally, beautifully broken. He looked at the woman beside him and knew that the recipes were just the beginning of what they were building together. Sterling set the 2 golden loaves of bread onto the cooling rack. The crust crackled as it met the cooler air of the kitchen, a sound like dry leaves underfoot. He wiped his hands on his apron and looked at Clementine. She was staring at the bread with an intensity usually reserved for holy relics. Her white fur was still dusted with flour, and a small smudge of white sat right on the tip of her twitching nose. "It sounds like it is talking to us," Clementine said. She leaned in close, her long ears tilted forward to catch the sound of the cooling crust. "It is just the steam escaping the structure we built," Sterling explained. He reached out and used his thumb to brush the flour from her nose. His touch was light, but the contact made her freeze. Her blue eyes locked onto his, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. A sharp, metallic rapping at the front door broke the silence. Sterling frowned. He was not expecting anyone, and Harrison usually just barged in. He walked to the door and opened it to find a small, hovering courier drone. It was a polished silver sphere with the emblem of the Ethelgard oversight etched into its side. The drone extended a mechanical arm, holding a physical envelope made of heavy, cream-colored parchment. Sterling took the letter, and the drone immediately zipped away into the blue-leafed canopy of the surrounding woods. He turned the envelope over. It was addressed to the occupant of Unit 4, Sector 7. "What is it?" Clementine asked, stepping into the hallway. Sterling opened the seal. "It is a notice of audit for the colonial sector," he said. "The board is coming to evaluate the integration of the new settlers. They want to see proof of sustainability and social cohesion." Clementine's ears dropped instantly, pressing flat against her head. Her face drained of color. "If I fail the audit, they will send me back to the Frost Belt," she whispered. "My people expect me to show that I have mastered the domestic arts of this colony. They think I am too focused on my work." Sterling looked at the letter again. The audit was scheduled for 3 days from now. He looked back at her and saw the genuine fear in her eyes. It was more than just a fear of moving. It was the fear of being told she did not belong. "You are a brilliant woman, Clementine," Sterling said firmly. "Why would they care if you can bake bread when you contribute so much else to this planet?" She looked at her feet, her fingers twisting the fabric of her floral dress. "Because to them, if you cannot sustain a home, you cannot sustain a community. But Sterling, there is something I have to tell you." He leaned against the doorframe, waiting. She took a deep breath and tapped a small sensor on her wrist. A holographic display shimmered into existence between them. It was not a recipe or a shopping list. It was a high-resolution topographical map of the northern continent of Navarra, filled with complex data points and shifting weather patterns. "I am a senior cartographer for the Planetary Expansion Project," she said, her voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "I mapped 3/4 of this sector before the first house was even built. I know every ridge and riverbed within 1,000 miles." Sterling looked at the map, then back at the woman who had spent the morning struggling to knead dough. "You are a high-level official," he stated. It was not a question. She nodded slowly. "But I am a failure at everything else. I spend my nights looking at coordinates and my days feeling like a ghost in my own house. I wanted to learn to cook because I was lonely, Sterling. I knew how to boil water. I even knew how to make a basic stew." Sterling felt a strange mix of surprise and a sudden, sharp clarity. "You mean the fire in your kitchen the other day was not an accident?" "It was an accident," she insisted, her face flushing a deep pink. "I was trying to make something complicated to impress you, and I forgot to vent the induction burner. But I leaned into the helplessness because it was the only way I knew how to talk to a man like you. You are so composed, so sure of yourself. I thought if I was just another official, you would treat me like a colleague. I did not want a colleague. I wanted a friend." The weight of her confession hung in the air. Sterling looked at the cooling bread, then at the intricate map glowing in the dim light of the hallway. He realized he had been doing the same thing. He had hidden behind his role as a teacher and a retired soldier to avoid the vulnerability of simply being a neighbor. "So the lessons were a shield," Sterling said. "For both of us, I think," she replied softly. Sterling stepped toward her, closing the distance. The map flickered and faded as she turned off the projector. He realized that the sterile, quiet life he had planned for his retirement was a cage he had built for himself. He had been waiting for the clock to run out, but this woman had walked in and demanded his time and his heart. "We are going to pass this audit," Sterling said. "Not because you need to prove you can cook, but because we are going to show them that this sector is a home. We will host a dinner, a real one." Clementine looked up, her ears twitching with a spark of hope. "You would do that, even though I lied about the soup?" Sterling smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "You did not lie about being a disaster in the kitchen. I saw that flour explosion with my own eyes. That was genuine talent." She let out a small, breathless laugh and leaned her head against his shoulder. The softness of her fur was a sharp contrast to the rough wool of his shirt. Sterling reached up and rested his hand on her back, feeling the tension slowly bleed out of her frame. "I will bring my maps," she said. "If we are going to host a feast, we should know exactly where every ingredient came from. I can show you the valley where the silver thyme grows wild." "I would like that," Sterling said. He felt a surge of protective affection for her. She was a woman who could chart a world but felt lost in a kitchen. He was a man who could feed an army but had forgotten how to eat for pleasure. Together, they were a strange, mismatched pair, but as they stood in the quiet hallway of his cottage, the silence no longer felt cold. "We have 3 days," Sterling said, pulling back to look at her. "No more pretending to be helpless. I want to see the cartographer's precision applied to a roast." Clementine stood taller, her confidence returning. "I can do precision, Sterling. Just do not ask me to flip a pancake without a safety net." He laughed and led her back into the kitchen. The bread was ready to be sliced, the steam had settled, and for the first time since he had arrived on Navarra, Sterling felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They began to plan the menu, 2 professionals turning their skills toward a shared goal. The audit was a threat, but as they worked side by side, it felt more like an opportunity. They were no longer just a teacher and a student. They were an alliance, and Sterling knew that whatever the oversight board threw at them, they would face it together. He cut a thick slice of the warm bread and handed it to her, watching the joy spread across her face. This was the heart of the matter. This was the recipe he had been looking for all along. Clementine was no longer fumbling with the oversized wooden spoons or staring at the induction burner as if it were an alien artifact. She stood at the stainless steel counter with a laser-guided focus that reminded Sterling of his old tactical officers. She did not just chop the azure root anymore. She calculated the optimal surface area for heat distribution, her knife moving with a rhythmic, metallic clicking against the board. "Your knife skills are terrifyingly efficient," Sterling said, watching her blade move in a blur of silver. "I spent 3 years mapping the subterranean caverns of the Frost Belt, Sterling. If I can navigate 1,000 miles of lightless tunnels with a malfunctioning compass, I can handle a Julienne." Clementine did not look up, but her ears twitched in a way that he had come to recognize as a sign of suppressed pride. The kitchen was filled with the scent of roasted spices and the sharp tang of citrus. They were not just making a meal anymore. They were constructing a defense. The Colonial Oversight Board valued 2 things above all else: efficiency and cultural integration. If Clementine appeared too alien or too isolated, the auditors would flag her for relocation to a high-density Leporan sector. If Sterling's retirement appeared unproductive, they might reclaim his veteran land grant to make room for more active colonists. "We need a centerpiece that says we belong here," Sterling noted. He pulled a tray of glazed tubers from the oven, the heat radiating against his face. "Something that bridges your world and mine." Clementine looked at the holographic map she had projected over the dining table. It showed the topography of Navarra, highlighting the mineral-rich soil zones where the best produce grew. "We should use the star fruit from the southern ridges," she said. "It is technically a weed to the locals, but with your glaze it becomes a delicacy. It shows we understand the land better than the auditors do. We are not just visitors. We are part of the ecosystem." Sterling leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. "You have been holding back, haven't you?" Clementine paused, the knife hovering over a red pepper. "I wanted to see if you like me for my company, Sterling, not my credentials. Most people on Navarra see a senior cartographer and they want favors. They want land rights or mining coordinates. You just wanted me to stop burning your kitchen down." Sterling smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "I still want that, but I also want to see what happens when we stop pretending." The door chime rang, a sharp rhythmic sound that cut through the warmth of the room. Harrison stepped inside, his heavy boots clicking on the tile. He looked at the maps, then at the perfectly prepped ingredients, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The audit committee is arriving 2 days early," Harrison said, his voice grim. "They are doing a sweep of the sector to catch people off guard. They will be at your door by tomorrow evening." Clementine's grip tightened on her knife. "That is not enough time to cure the meat for the main course. We need at least 48 hours for the salt to penetrate the fiber." "Then we change the plan," Sterling said firmly. He did not let the panic touch his voice. Years of cooking for thousands of soldiers during planetary sieges had taught him that a kitchen was just another type of battlefield. "We do not need a week-long cure to prove we are a team. We need something immediate, something visceral." Harrison shook his head, looking between the two of them. "Sterling, you are risking your pension on a Leporan who only just learned how to use an oven. The board is looking for reasons to consolidate these sectors. They want you back in the fleet as a senior logistics officer, and they want her back in the mapping labs in the capital. They do not want people living quiet lives on the frontier." "I am not going back to a galley on a starship," Sterling replied. "And she is not going back to a hole in the ground. We have made a home here." Bianca entered behind Harrison, her expression softer than her brother's. She carried a jar of wild honey from the western plains. The liquid inside was a deep, translucent amber. "I brought this for you," she said. "It is the purest grade. If you use this in the glaze, the auditors will be too busy eating to ask difficult questions." Sterling took the jar, the weight of it solid in his hand. "Thank you, Bianca." The four of them stood in the small kitchen, a makeshift barricade against the bureaucratic storm approaching. Sterling felt a surge of that old military camaraderie, but it was tempered by something softer and more personal. He looked at Clementine. She was no longer the clumsy neighbor who needed saving. She was his partner. "We are going to make a meal they will never forget," Sterling said. "Not because it follows their rules, but because it breaks them." Clementine reached out and squeezed his hand. Her palm was warm, and for a moment the fear of the audit faded into the background. "We will map out every flavor," she whispered. "They will not find a single flaw in our terrain." As the night deepened, the pressure began to take its toll. A batch of heavy cream curdled in the heat, and a tray of delicate pastries crumbled as they left the oven. Clementine stared at the mess on the floor, her shoulders slumping. "I cannot do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I am a cartographer. I deal with lines and data. This is too fluid. It changes every second. I am going to fail the audit and they are going to send me to the frost belt." Sterling stepped over the spilled cream and took her by the shoulders. He forced her to look at him, ignoring the frantic timer ticking on the stove. "Listen to me. I was a ghost in this house until you started making a mess of it. I had my medals and my silence and I was miserable. You brought life back into this kitchen." "But I am ruining everything," she argued, a tear tracking through the light dusting of flour on her cheek. "You are not," Sterling said. He wiped the tear away with his thumb. "I do not care about the council or the perfect roast. I care about the fact that you showed up at my door with a burnt pot of soup and reminded me that I was still alive. We are not doing this for the auditors. We are doing this for us." Clementine took a shaky breath and nodded. "For us." They worked through the rest of the night in a rhythmic silence. Their movements finally began to sync up as they moved around the narrow kitchen. Sterling handled the heat and the proteins while Clementine managed the precision of the sides and the aesthetic arrangement. There was no more flour on the floor. There were no more accidental fires. Every movement was deliberate and coordinated. As the sun began to rise over the indigo forests of Navarra, the first course was finally prepped. It was a chilled salad of silver-leaf greens and shaved star fruit, drizzled with the wild honey and topped with toasted seeds. It looked like a map of the planet itself, a landscape of color and texture. Sterling watched Clementine as she carefully placed a single herb on the final plate. She looked tired, but her eyes were bright with a fierce intelligence. He realized then that he did not just enjoy her company. He respected her. She had navigated the complexities of a new world alone, and now she was helping him navigate the complexities of a life he had almost given up on. "You should sleep for a few hours," Sterling suggested. "I can handle the slow roast for the next few hours." "I am not leaving you alone in this, Sterling," she said. "If we are an alliance, we stay together until the last plate is cleared." He did not argue. He pulled a chair out for her and poured a glass of cold spring water. They sat in the quiet of the early morning, the only sound the gentle bubbling of a pot on the stove. The threat of the audit felt smaller now. They had built something in this kitchen that was sturdier than any colonial regulation. Sterling reached over and brushed a stray hair from her forehead. His hand lingered there for a moment longer than necessary. "Whatever happens when they walk through that door," he began. She cut him off with a soft smile. "We already won, Sterling. Look at this room. It is not a workplace anymore." He looked around his home. She was right. The sterile, organized space he had maintained for months was gone. In its place was a room that felt alive, filled with the remnants of their shared labor and the promise of a future they were carving out together. He knew the auditors would be cold and calculating, but they would not be prepared for the warmth he and Clementine had cultivated in the heart of the Navarra wilderness. They were ready. The gravel crunched under the heavy boots of the three-person audit team exactly at dawn. Sterling stood on the porch of his cottage, his back straight and his hands clasped behind him in the formal stance he had perfected over 20 years in the Galactic Fleet. Beside him, Clementine smoothed her white fur and adjusted the collar of her tunic. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were sharp and focused. A tall man with a sharp jaw and a tablet tucked under his arm led the group. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked up at them with a neutral expression. "I am Inspector Kale," he said. "This is an unscheduled evaluation of domestic integration and colonial stability for Sector 7. Sterling nodded once. "You are early, Inspector, but we are prepared." Kale stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the cleanliness of the entryway. "We find that early arrivals provide a more honest view of life on the frontier," he replied. "I see you have a Leporan resident on a human-designated homestead. This requires specific documentation of mutual benefit." Clementine stepped forward before Sterling could speak. "My name is Clementine, Senior Cartographer for the Navarra Survey Bureau. My presence here is a strategic partnership that ensures both agricultural success and local topographical mastery." Kale raised an eyebrow. "I was informed you were here for domestic training, not a professional internship." "It is both," Sterling interrupted, his voice calm and authoritative. "A colony cannot survive on maps alone, and it cannot thrive on food without direction. We have integrated our skills to create a foundation for this sector. Please come inside. The breakfast service is ready." The interior of the cottage smelled of roasted grains and sweet citrus. Sterling led them to the dining table, which had been set with a precision that would have passed a flagship inspection. He had used the silver-rimmed plates he kept for special occasions, and the center of the table held a bowl of local glass lilies that Clementine had harvested from the nearby ridge. Kale sat at the head of the table while his two assistants took their places on either side. They didn't speak. They simply opened their digital logs and waited. Sterling moved into the kitchen with a fluid efficiency. He plated the first course, a chilled melon soup infused with ginger root and topped with crushed toasted seeds. He placed a bowl in front of each auditor without a sound. Clementine stood by the window, her posture formal. "The seeds are harvested from the northern slopes," she explained as they began to eat. They are high in protein and help regulate body temperature in Navarra's fluctuating climate. Sterling's preparation makes them bioavailable for human digestion. Kale took a spoonful of the soup. He paused, his expression shifting from cold professional mask to genuine surprise. The flavor is balanced, he admitted, but flavor does not prove integration. Integration is about more than just a shared roof, Sterling said as he cleared the first bowls. It is about creating a new culture that belongs to this planet instead of clinging to the ones we left behind. Clementine taught me how to find these ingredients. I taught her how to refine them. We are not just living together. We are building a standard for everyone who follows us. The main course followed. A savory tart made from local tubers and a sharp, aged cheese that Sterling had been curing for months. The crust was flaky and golden, a testament to the hours they had spent kneading dough until their arms ached. As the auditors ate, the tension in the room began to thaw. One of the assistants leaned toward Clementine. "I heard the soil in this region was too acidic for these tubers," the woman said. "It is," Clementine replied with a confident smile. "But Sterling suggested we use the ash from the hardwood trees we cleared for the garden. The mineral content neutralized the pH. My maps showed the high-density ash deposits from the last volcanic cycle, and his chemistry did the rest." Kale set his fork down. He looked from Sterling to Clementine. There was a long silence that made Sterling's pulse quicken, though he kept his face a mask of military discipline. "I have conducted 40 audits this cycle," Kale said finally. "Most of them are a performance. People hide their messes and recite scripts they think I want to hear, but this feels different. You two move in this kitchen like you have been a team for years." Sterling looked at Clementine. She was looking back at him, her blue eyes bright with a mixture of relief and something much deeper. "We had a few rough starts," Sterling admitted, "but the best recipes usually require a little heat to set properly." Kale stood up and signaled to his assistants. They closed their tablets with a synchronized click. "I will be recommending a permanent residency status for this household," Kale announced. "Your partnership is a model for colonial stability. I expect a full report on your agricultural techniques sent to the central office by the end of the week." "Thank you, Inspector," Sterling said. Kale paused at the door. "And Sterling, that tart was better than anything I have had at the Capitol. Keep the recipe." As the shuttle lifted off and disappeared into the pale blue sky of Navarra, Sterling felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't realized he was carrying. He turned to Clementine, who was already leaning against the porch railing, her ears twitching in the cool morning air. "We did it," she whispered. Sterling walked over and stood beside her. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched the way the light caught the silver tips of her fur. "You did it," he corrected her. "You were the one who remembered the ash trick. I just made the crust." She laughed, a bright sound that echoed through the quiet valley. "I think we both know I would have burned the house down if you hadn't walked in that day." Sterling reached out and took her hand. His rough, calloused fingers fit perfectly against her smaller ones. "I think I was the one who was burning out, Clementine. You just gave me something worth keeping the fire going for." A few hours later, a familiar hover truck pulled into the drive. Harrison and Bianca climbed out, both looking anxious. Harrison didn't even wait to reach the porch before shouting, "Well, did they kick you off the planet or are we celebrating?" Sterling smiled and held up a hand. "We are celebrating, Harrison. Get the good cider out of your truck." Bianca ran up and hugged Clementine, the two sisters laughing as they spun in a circle. "I knew you could do it," Bianca said. "I told you he was a good teacher." "He is more than that," Clementine said, looking over at Sterling. The afternoon was spent in the garden. They moved the dining table outside under the shade of the blue-leaf trees. Sterling served the remains of the feast while Harrison told loud, exaggerated stories of their days in the fleet. For the first time since his retirement, Sterling didn't feel like a man waiting for the end of his life. He felt like a man at the beginning of one. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the fields, Harrison and Bianca finally said their goodbyes and drove away. The cottage returned to a peaceful silence, but it wasn't the empty silence Sterling had lived in for so long. It was a full, resonant quiet. Sterling and Clementine sat on the porch steps, watching the single moon of Navarra rise over the jagged peaks of the mountains. The air was cool, but the warmth from the day lingered in the wood of the house. "What happens tomorrow?" Clementine asked softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Tomorrow," Sterling said, putting his arm around her, "I think we start on that orchard you wanted to map out, and maybe you can show me where those wild berries grow on the eastern slope." She smiled and closed her eyes. "I would like that, but Sterling—" "Yes." "No more lessons for a while," she said, her voice drifting into sleepiness. "I just want to cook because I love the way the kitchen smells when we are both in it." Sterling kissed the top of her head. He looked out at the vast, untamed wilderness of Navarra and felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent his life serving an empire, but here, in this small corner of the galaxy, he had finally found a home. "That sounds like a perfect plan," he whispered. They sat together in the starlight, two souls from different worlds who had found a common language in the simple act of sharing a life. The garden was growing, the pantry was full, and for the first time in a very long time, Sterling was exactly where he was supposed to be. The dew on the blue-leafed ferns felt cold against Sterling's boots as they climbed the eastern slope of the ridge. He carried a pack filled with dried fruit, fresh bread, and a thermos of bitter root tea. Beside him, Clementine moved with a grace that belied the rugged terrain. Her long ears twitched at every rustle in the undergrowth, and her eyes remained fixed on the digital slate in her hands. "The soil here is richer than near the cottage," Sterling said, pausing to catch his breath. He looked back at the valley where their home sat, a small patch of order in the wild expanse of Navarra. "It is the volcanic runoff from the peaks," Clementine replied. "The minerals are perfect for the berries we found yesterday, but the readings are strange, Sterling." He stepped closer, looking over her shoulder at the shifting lines on the screen. He was used to reading tactical displays, not geological surveys, but the anomaly was clear. A series of rhythmic pulses originated from deep beneath the basalt shelf they were standing on. "Could it be a natural gas vent?" he asked. Clementine shook her head, her expression focused. "The frequency is too regular. Nature rarely works in perfect intervals." Sterling felt a spark of the old curiosity that had driven him through his years in the fleet. Navarra was a frontier planet, largely unexplored beyond the designated colonial zones. The idea that something lay beneath their feet, hidden from the initial orbital scans, was both exhilarating and unsettling. He scanned the tree line, his eyes searching for any sign of disturbance. "We should mark the coordinates and head back," Sterling said. "We are not equipped for a deep survey today." Clementine looked up at him, her blue eyes bright with excitement. "But Sterling, if this is an ancient structure, it could change everything we know about this sector. Think of the history we might find." "I am thinking about the fact that we have one flashlight and half a liter of tea," he replied with a faint smile. "And I promised your sister we would have dinner ready by sundown." She sighed but nodded, saving the data to her device. "You are far too practical sometimes." "It is why I am still alive, Clementine." They began their descent back toward the valley. The path was narrow, winding through clusters of silver-bark trees that smelled of cinnamon and wet earth. As they walked, Sterling thought about the life they were carving out. The audit was behind them and their status was secure, but the planet itself still held secrets that refused to stay buried. When they reached the edge of the homestead, they saw a familiar hover utility vehicle parked near the garden. Harrison was leaning against the rusted fender, tossing a small stone into the air. Beside him, Bianca was inspecting the irrigation lines Sterling had installed the week before. "You two took your time," Harrison called out as they approached. "I was about to start the grill myself, and we all know how that ends." Sterling laughed, unbuckling his pack. "You would probably set the forest on fire, Harrison. What brings you out here on a Tuesday?" Harrison's expression shifted, becoming more serious. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted data chip. "A courier from the capital dropped this off at my station. It is marked for your eyes only, Sterling. It comes from the High Command." Sterling felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had retired. He had signed the papers, completed his service, and chosen a life of obscurity. He took the chip, the metal feeling unnaturally heavy in his palm. "I am a chef, Harrison," Sterling said. "What could High Command want with a man who spends his days kneading dough?" Harrison looked at Clementine, then back at Sterling. "They did not say, but the signature on the encryption is from Admiral Vance. He was your commanding officer during the siege of Cora." Sterling nodded slowly. Vance was a man who did not send messages unless the situation was dire. He pocketed the chip, aware of Clementine's concerned gaze. "Let us eat first," Sterling said, his voice steady despite the sudden tension. Problems always look smaller on a full stomach. The group moved toward the cottage. Sterling spent the next hour in the kitchen, his movements fluid and precise. He chopped vegetables, seared the marinated meat, and prepared a glaze of honey and local spices. Cooking was his meditation. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the wooden board grounded him. Clementine stayed close, helping where she could. She did not ask about the chip, but she kept placing her hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support. The meal was served on the back porch, overlooking the valley. For a while, the conversation stayed light. They talked about the orchard and the way the local wildlife seemed to be getting bolder. Harrison told stories about the latest mishaps at the colonial trade hub, making Bianca laugh until she nearly spilled her drink. But as the light began to fade, turning the sky into a bruised purple, the reality of the message could no longer be ignored. Sterling set his fork down and looked at the data chip sitting on the edge of the table. He tapped the chip against his slate, and a holographic projection shimmered into existence. It was a map. "That is the eastern slope," Clementine whispered, leaning forward. "The exact area we were just standing on." The map showed the same basalt shelf she had detected, but the holographic overlay revealed what lay beneath. A massive, interconnected network of chambers stretched deep into the mountainside. Icons flashed in red, marking specific points of interest. There was a brief text crawl at the bottom of the projection. Sterling read it aloud. "Operation Hearthstone, Priority Alpha. Sterling, we found something we cannot identify. The Colonial Board says it is a geological anomaly, but my scouts say otherwise. I need someone I can trust to verify the site before the bureaucrats shut it down. You are the closest asset with the necessary clearance." Harrison whistled softly. "An asset. They still see you as a tool, Sterling." Sterling looked at the map, then at Clementine. She was not looking at the military markers. She was looking at the beauty of the structure, the way it wound through the earth like the roots of a great tree. "They are not asking for a soldier," Sterling said. "They are asking for a scout." "And a chef?" Bianca asked, her brow furrowed. "Maybe," Sterling replied. "Vance knows I do not just see the terrain. I see the resources. I see how to sustain a team in the middle of nowhere." Clementine reached out and touched the holographic map. "If this is what I think it is, Sterling, it is not just a bunker. It is a seed vault, an ancient one. The sensors are picking up biological signatures that do not match anything currently on Navarra." The implications were staggering. If there was a cache of ancient life on the planet, it could mean the difference between Navarra being a struggling colony and becoming a garden world. "I am not going back to the military," Sterling said, his voice firm. "I am a citizen of this planet now." Harrison nodded. "Then we do it on our terms. We do not report back to Vance until we know what we are dealing with. We go as a private survey team. Sterling looked at Clementine. It is your map. It is your discovery. Do you want to find out what is down there? I spent my life making maps of things people had already found, she said. I want to be the one who finds something new. Sterling felt a surge of pride. He took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. Then we go tomorrow, but tonight we finish the pie. The tension did not vanish, but it transformed into a shared sense of purpose. They sat in the deepening twilight, the holographic map still glowing between them like a campfire. Sterling knew the peace of his retirement had changed. It was not the end of his quiet life, but the beginning of a larger one. He looked at his friends and the woman he loved. He had spent years following orders, moving across the stars at the whim of others. Now he was making his own choices, driven by a connection to a place and a person rather than a duty to an empire. The stars of Navarra began to poke through the purple haze of the sky. Sterling realized that home was not just a house. It was the strength found in an unexpected alliance and the warmth of a shared dream. Whatever lay beneath the eastern slope, they would face it together. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Sterling woke before the first light of Navarra touched the valley floor. He did not need an alarm. Years in the galley of a heavy cruiser had etched a permanent clock into his mind. He moved through the cottage with silent efficiency, packing a rugged rucksack with thermal regulators, high-calorie rations, and a specialized toolkit he had kept from his service days. He checked the seal on his canteen and placed a small, handheld scanner on top of the gear. The door to the guest room opened, and Clementine stepped out. She was dressed in heavy-duty canvas trousers and a thick wool sweater that made her look smaller than usual. Her long, white ears were alert, swiveling toward the window where the sky was just beginning to turn a pale, dusty violet. "Are you ready?" Sterling asked, his voice low and steady. "I have the topographical overlays loaded into my wrist unit," Clementine said. She adjusted the strap of her own pack, her fingers trembling slightly. "I did not sleep much. The pulses were stronger during the night. They felt like a heartbeat." Sterling walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. The warmth of his palm seemed to ground her. "We take it one step at a time. Harrison and Bianca will be here in 10 minutes. We move as a team." The sound of a heavy engine echoed through the valley. A moment later, a rugged, six-wheeled rover pulled into the clearing. Harrison was at the wheel, looking every bit the hardened veteran in his faded flight jacket. Bianca sat in the passenger seat, already checking the charge on a pair of industrial lanterns. Sterling and Clementine met them at the porch. Harrison hopped out of the vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I brought the seismic dampeners you asked for, Sterling. If that ridge is as unstable as the readings suggest, we are going to need more than just good intentions to stay upright." Bianca handed a pair of heavy gloves to Clementine. "These are reinforced with kinetic mesh. If we have to climb the basalt shelf, you will want the extra grip." The group loaded the last of the supplies into the rover and set off toward the eastern ridge. The transition from the lush valley to the volcanic highlands was abrupt. The blue-leaf trees gave way to fields of glassgrass that shimmered like shattered mirrors in the rising light. The rover bounced over the uneven terrain, its suspension groaning under the weight of the gear. "Tell me about these pulses again," Harrison said, glancing at the sensor display on the dashboard. "I am seeing a rhythmic distortion in the local magnetic field. It is too consistent to be natural tectonic activity." Clementine leaned forward, pointing to a spike on the screen. "It is a resonant frequency, Harrison. It matches the ancient geological maps I found in the archives of Velos Prime. Those maps suggested a subterranean cavity designed to withstand a planetary shift. If this is a seed vault, it was built to be found only when the planet was stable enough to sustain life again." Sterling watched the horizon. He saw a flicker of movement near a cluster of jagged rocks. He narrowed his eyes, tracking the shape. We might not be the only ones interested in this site. Keep the speed steady, Harrison. I saw a surveillance drone. Military, Bianca asked, her voice tightening. Unmarked, Sterling replied. Probably a private salvage firm or a rogue corporate scout. They have been sniffing around this sector since the audit was finalized. They know Navarra is becoming valuable. Harrison gripped the steering wheel tighter. Let them try. We have the legal residency papers. This ridge is part of our collective land grant. They reached the base of the basalt shelf an hour later. The massive wall of black rock rose hundreds of feet into the air, its surface etched with deep, vertical fissures. The rhythmic pulses were no longer just data on a screen. They were a physical sensation, a deep thrumming that vibrated in the soles of their boots and the marrow of their bones. It is coming from behind that main slab, Clementine said, jumping down from the rover. She held her scanner out, the blue light reflecting in her wide eyes. The signal is strongest near the base. There is a structural weakness here. Sterling joined her, running his gloved hand over the cold, dark stone. He felt the vibration. It was steady, like a giant clock ticking deep within the earth. He looked at the seam where the basalt met the shale. This is not a natural crack. It is a door. He looked back at Harrison. Get the thermal cutter and the hydraulic jacks. We need to clear the debris before the sun gets too high. If that drone comes back, I want us under the overhang. The next 2 hours were a blur of coordinated labor. Sterling and Harrison worked with the precision of men who had spent decades following complex tactical orders. They positioned the jacks and applied pressure to the base of the slab, while Bianca monitored the structural integrity of the cliff above them. Clementine used her cartographic software to find the exact pressure points needed to shift the massive weight without causing a cave-in. Slowly, the basalt slab began to groan. A shower of dust and small pebbles rained down on them. Sterling put his weight against the lever, his muscles straining against his shirt. Now, Harrison, push. With a grinding roar that echoed across the valley, the slab slid back several inches, revealing a dark, narrow passage. A rush of cold, stagnant air blew out from the opening, carrying the scent of dry earth and ancient metal. Clementine stepped forward, her lantern cutting through the darkness. The light hit a smooth, metallic surface just inside the entrance. It was a door made of a dull, silver alloy, unmarked by rust or decay. In the center was a circular indentation, perfectly sized for a hand. Sterling reached out and caught her wrist. Wait, we do not know what kind of security is still active. I do, Clementine whispered. She looked at the scanner in her other hand. The frequency of the pulse is a key. It is looking for a biological signature that matches the planetary resonance. It is not a lock for a soldier. It is a lock for a gardener. She stepped up to the door and placed her hand in the indentation. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, the rhythmic thrumming reached a crescendo. The silver door began to glow with a soft, amber light. A series of mechanical clicks echoed through the passage, and the door slid upward into the ceiling with a hiss of pressurized gas. Beyond the door lay a vast, circular chamber. Rows of glowing canisters lined the walls, each one filled with seeds, saplings, and genetic material from 1,000 different worlds. In the center of the room, a holographic display flickered to life, showing a map of Navarra as it had looked 10,000 years ago. We found it, Bianca said, her voice filled with awe. Sterling stepped into the chamber, his hand finding Clementine. He felt a profound sense of peace. This was not a weapon. It was a promise. The ancient builders had left this here to ensure that life would always have a second chance. We have to protect this, Sterling said, looking at his friends. If the corporations get their hands on this, they will patent every blade of grass on the planet. Clementine leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. They will not get it. We are the ones who found it. We are the ones who live here. Sterling looked at the glowing canisters and then at the woman beside him. He had spent his life preparing for war, but in this quiet vault he realized he was finally ready for peace. He squeezed her hand, a silent vow passing between them. They would keep this secret until Navarra was ready to bloom. They had found more than just a vault. They had found the future of their home. Sterling moved his hand over the smooth, cool surface of the storage canisters. He could feel a faint vibration through the metal, a steady rhythm that felt more like a heartbeat than a machine. He looked over at Clementine. She stood bathed in the soft blue light of a primary terminal, her fingers dancing across a holographic interface that responded to the slightest touch of her furred fingertips. Her long ears were swept back in deep concentration, and her eyes reflected the scrolling lines of ancient code. "We have to map the logic of the cooling system before we can even think about moving anything," Clementine said. She did not look up, but her voice was steady. "These canisters are held in a specific stasis. If we break the seal without the proper environmental stabilization, the genetic material inside will degrade in minutes." Sterling walked to her side, his heavy boots clucking against the polished stone floor. He placed a hand on the console next to hers, offering a silent anchor of support. "How much time do we have before the external sensors register our presence here?" Clementine bit her lip. "The door we opened triggered a low-level power draw. It is not a loud signal, but anyone looking for a spike in the regional grid will see it. We might have an hour, maybe less if they have satellites positioned over this hemisphere." Harrison walked back from the entrance tunnel, his rifle slung over his shoulder but his hand resting near the grip. He looked at the vast rows of silver pods stretching into the darkness of the mountain. "This is a lot of weight to move, Sterling. Even with the industrial lifter on the rover, we can only take a fraction of this. If the corporate scouts arrive, they will secure the site and we will be locked out for good." "Then we do not move the pods," Sterling said. He turned to look at the center of the room where a massive pillar of translucent crystal rose toward the ceiling. "We secure the terminal. Clementine, can you lock this system down? Make it so that only a specific signature can access the vault." "I can try to encrypt the primary route," she replied, "but these systems are ancient. They do not use standard colonial encryption. It is biological. It responded to me because I carry the markers of the original surveyors." Bianca joined them, carrying a small handheld scanner she had been using to check the perimeter. "There are signatures approaching from the north," she said. Her voice was taut with a sudden edge of urgency. "Two high-speed flyers. They are not military. They have the marking of the Vanguard group." Sterling felt a familiar tightening in his chest. It was the same feeling he had known in the mess halls of the fleet when a surprise inspection or a sudden skirmish was about to break. He looked at Clementine, who had gone pale at the mention of the corporation. Vanguard was known for their aggressive land claims. If they found this vault, they would claim the entire basalt shelf as a private laboratory. "Harrison, take Bianca and set up a sensor ghost at the lower ridge," Sterling ordered. "Use the flares and the emergency beacons from the rover to make it look like we are a survey team stuck in a rockslide. Lead them away from this entrance." Harrison nodded, his expression grim but focused. "You heard the man, Bianca. Let's go make some noise." As they hurried back toward the tunnel, Sterling turned back to Clementine. He could see her hands shaking. He stepped closer and placed his hands over hers, stopping her frantic typing. "Look at me," he said softly. Clementine looked up, her blue eyes wide. "Sterling, if they get in here, everything we worked for on Navarra changes. They will turn this planet into a factory." "I know," he said, "and that is why they are not getting in. You are the smartest person I have ever met, and you know this planet better than any map. Trust your hands. Do what you did in the kitchen." "In the kitchen?" she asked, a small, confused smile touching her lips. "You improvised," Sterling reminded her. "You took what was there and you made something new. This terminal is just another recipe. Find the ingredients that lock the door." Clementine took a deep breath. Her ears perked up and the shaking in her hands subsided. "You are right. It is just a different kind of chemistry." She turned back to the console with renewed purpose. Sterling stood guard, his back to her, watching the silver door that led to the surface. He thought about his retirement. He had come to Navarra to escape the demands of the galaxy, to find a quiet corner where he could cook and grow old. He had not expected to find a cause worth fighting for, nor had he expected to find it alongside a woman who could make a simple loaf of bread feel like a grand achievement. A muffled explosion echoed from the ridge outside. That was Harrison. He was likely using the mining charges to create the landslide he had promised. The ground beneath Sterling's feet groaned, and dust drifted down from the ceiling. "I have it," Clementine whispered. She sounded breathless. "I have routed the door controls through the geothermal vent system. Unless they want to trigger a localized volcanic eruption, they cannot force the locks." Sterling turned to see the holographic display turn a deep, solid amber. "Can you get us out?" "There is a maintenance crawlspace that exits near the eastern canyon," she said. "It was designed for the original builders. It will be a tight fit, but we can bypass the main entrance entirely." Sterling reached out and took her hand. He pulled her away from the console as the sound of flyer engines grew louder outside. They had to move fast. They navigated the darkening vault, weaving between the rows of genetic history. Sterling felt a profound sense of responsibility. They were no longer just a chef and a cartographer. They were the keepers of Navarra's future. They reached the crawlspace, a narrow metal chute that smelled of dry earth and ancient dust. Sterling let Clementine go first, watching as she disappeared into the shadows. He took one last look at the vault. The canisters glowed with a steady, peaceful light. As he pulled himself into the chute, he felt a surge of adrenaline. The corporations would arrive to find a sealed tomb and a fake landslide. It would buy them time. They needed to get back to the valley, regroup with Harrison and Bianca, and find a way to make this discovery public before Vanguard could bury it. The crawlspace opened up onto a narrow ledge overlooking the eastern canyon. The air was cool and smelled of rain. Sterling helped Clementine out of the tunnel, his hands lingering on her waist as he set her on solid ground. They stood in the shadows of a massive basalt pillar, watching as the two corporate flyers circled the northern ridge, where the smoke from Harrison's diversion rose into the sky. "We did it," Clementine whispered, leaning against him. Sterling wrapped an arm around her, drawing her close. He could feel her heart racing against his side. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We have a secret to keep and a planet to save." Clementine looked up at him, her eyes bright with a mix of fear and excitement. "I think I preferred the bread making, Sterling." He chuckled, the sound low and warm in the quiet of the canyon. "Me too, but I think we have a talent for this." They began the long trek down the canyon toward their hidden rover. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the landscape of Navarra. Sterling felt a deep sense of alignment. He had spent his life serving an empire, but here, on this wild frontier, he was finally serving something real. He looked at the woman walking beside him and knew that no matter what the corporations tried, they would not win. Navarra belonged to the people who loved it, and he was finally one of them. The rover sat hidden beneath a canopy of weeping amber trees, its camouflage netting shimmering under the fading light of the primary sun. Sterling signaled to Harrison, who was perched on a jagged basalt rock with a long-range scanner. Harrison hopped down, his expression grim as he wiped dust from his tactical vest. "They are widening the search grid," Harrison said. 3 more flyers just broke the clouds over the northern ridge. They are not looking for minerals anymore. They are looking for us." Sterling shoved his gear into the back of the rover and turned to Clementine. She was pale, her fingers trembling slightly as she tucked a small, bioluminescent data drive into the pocket of her flight jacket. "Did you get the full encryption key from the vault terminal?" Sterling asked. Clementine nodded, her blue eyes reflecting the soft glow of the drive. "I have everything. The genetic maps, the climate sequences, and the original terraforming protocols. It is the entire history of Navarra, Sterling. If Vanguard gets this, they can patent the very air we breathe. They will own every farm and every forest. Then we make sure they never touch it, Sterling said. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her frame. He did not treat her like a civilian in distress. He looked at her with the respect of a fellow soldier holding a vital flank. Bianca, get us moving. We need to reach the old communications array at Vespers Hollow before they establish a full perimeter. Bianca climbed into the driver's seat, her long ears twitching as she monitored the radio frequencies. The local authorities are being paid to look the other way, she reported. I am picking up chatter from Vanguard Security. They have authorized the use of non-lethal force, but their definition of non-lethal usually involves a month in a recovery tank. The rover roared to life, the electric motors humming with a low-power growl that Sterling found comforting. He climbed into the passenger seat and checked his sidearm, a relic from his fleet days that he had hoped never to use again. He looked at the dashboard maps. Vespers Hollow was a narrow gorge 300 miles to the east, accessible only through a series of ancient lava tubes. Why the array? Clementine asked, leaning forward between the seats. If we go there, we are cornered. It is a dead end. It is a broadcast point, Sterling explained. If we can upload these files to the Public Colonial Board, the vault becomes common property. Vanguard cannot seize what the entire galaxy can see. The moment that data hits the open net, their legal claim vanishes. They will have to pack up and leave or face an imperial inquiry. Harrison sat in the back, checking the charge on a portable jammer. And if we do not make it in time, Sterling. We make it, Sterling said. His voice was iron. He had spent decades following orders that did not matter, cooking meals for officers who did not care. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for a home he actually loved, alongside a woman who had taught him that peace was something you had to build, not just find. The rover lurched forward, bouncing over the uneven terrain of the canyon floor. Bianca drove with a frantic precision, weaving between the towering basalt pillars that characterized the Navarran highlands. Above them, the sky turned a deep, bruised purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first of the Vanguard flyers screamed overhead, its searchlights cutting through the darkness like white blades. Turn off the lights, Sterling commanded. Navigate by thermal. Bianca flipped a switch, and the world outside the reinforced glass turned into a landscape of oranges and yellows. They were driving blind to the naked eye, relying entirely on the sensor suite. Clementine reached out and gripped Sterling's arm. Her touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold metal of the rover's interior. I am sorry I brought you into this, she whispered. You wanted a quiet retirement. You wanted to bake bread and watch the wind. Sterling didn't look away from the thermal screen, but he covered her hand with his. I was dying in that cottage, Clementine. I was just waiting for the clock to run out. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning. If protecting this planet means I never bake another loaf of bread, it is a price I will pay 1,000 times over. She leaned her head against his shoulder for a brief second. I think you are a better man than you realize, Sterling. I am just a man who knows a good thing when he sees it, he replied. A sudden proximity alarm blared from the console. Bianca slammed on the brakes, sending the rover into a controlled skid. A massive Vanguard transport had dropped directly into their path, its heavy landing struts crushing the blue-leafed shrubs. 4 armored security guards stepped out, their rifles raised. They found us, Harrison growled, reaching for the door handle. I will draw their fire. You 3 get the data to the array. No, Sterling said, grabbing Harrison's collar. We stay together. Bianca, reverse. There is a secondary trail through the Silver Creek bed. It is narrow, but we can squeeze through. The tires spun, kicking up a cloud of red dust as Bianca threw the vehicle into gear. The security guards opened fire, the blue bolts of ionized energy splashing against the rover's reinforced hull. The sound was like hammers hitting a tin roof. Sterling felt the impact in his teeth. "Go, go, go," Sterling shouted. Bianca pushed the throttle to the floor. The rover surged backward, then pivoted, its tires gripping the loose shale of the creek bed. They plunged into the narrow ravine, the walls closing in until there were only inches of clearance on either side. The Vanguard transport was too large to follow, but the flyers were already banking for another pass. Clementine was typing furiously on a handheld terminal. "I am trying to bypass the array's security protocols from here," she said. "If I can get a handshake signal before we arrive, we can start the upload the second we plug in." "Can you do it?" Sterling asked. "I am a senior cartographer, Sterling. I have been mapping the digital architecture of this planet for 5 years. Just get me to that tower." The chase continued through the night. They raced across the salt flats of the Glass Sea, the rover's tires kicking up plumes of white powder that looked like snow in the moonlight. Sterling watched the rear monitors, his eyes tracking the red dots of the pursuing flyers. They were gaining. The corporate pilots were skilled, and their craft were faster than a civilian rover. "We are 5 miles out," Bianca shouted over the roar of the wind. "I see the spire." The communications array was a skeletal needle of silver metal rising from the center of a deep, bowl-shaped crater. It was an ancient piece of infrastructure, built during the first wave of colonization and largely forgotten. As they crested the rim of the crater, Sterling saw the lights of a second Vanguard team already setting up a perimeter at the base of the tower. "They anticipated us," Harrison said, his voice flat. "They knew this was the only broadcast point within range." "Then we go through them," Sterling said. He looked at Clementine. "When we hit the base, I need you to run for the elevator. Harrison and I will hold the stairs. Bianca, you stay with the rover and keep the engine hot. If we have to jump for it, I want us moving before the doors close." Clementine looked at the armed men below, then back at Sterling. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked determined. "I will get the signal out, Sterling, I promise." Sterling checked his sidearm one last time. He felt a strange sense of clarity. His life had been a series of kitchens and barracks, of orders and recipes. Now it was down to this. One woman, one planet, and one chance to do something that actually mattered. "Hold on," Bianca yelled. The rover plummeted down the steep incline of the crater, its suspension screaming as it hit the flat ground at the bottom. Sterling braced himself, his eyes fixed on the silver spire ahead. The corporate guards scrambled to their positions, but they weren't expecting a 3-ton rover to come charging at them like a kinetic slug. Sterling felt the impact as they smashed through the first line of barricades. He was already moving before the rover had even come to a full stop. He kicked the door open, his military training taking over as he rolled into the dirt and came up with his weapon leveled. Now he roared, "Move!" He grabbed Clementine's hand and pulled her toward the elevator, the air around them snapping with the energy of incoming fire. He didn't think about the risk. He only thought about the look on her face when she had first tasted his bread, and the way she laughed when she got flour on her nose. He would give her the world, even if he had to fight every corporation in the galaxy to do it. Sterling took cover behind a rusted support beam, the metal groaning as pulse fire sparked against the far side. He checked his magazine count with a quick, practiced glance. He had enough to keep the security team pinned, but not enough to win a war of attrition. Harrison was 20 yards to his left, using the overturned wreckage of the rover as a shield. The man was a crack shot, his movements precise and economical, a remnant of a life he had tried to leave behind. "Harrison," Sterling called over the sharp cracks of the exchange. "Keep them off the stairs." "I have the flank," Harrison shouted back, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Just tell the girl to move faster." Sterling looked up at the gantry. Clementine was climbing the maintenance ladder, her satchel bouncing against her hip. She did not look like the clumsy neighbor who had scorched a pot of soup anymore. She looked like a woman who knew exactly where she was going and why she was going there. Bianca followed close behind her, providing rear security with a stolen corporate stun baton gripped tightly in both hands. Sterling turned back to the security team. They were wearing Vanguard tactical gear in charcoal gray, moving in a standard wedge formation to try and outflank the rover. They were professionals, but they were fighting for a paycheck and a corporate bonus. Sterling was fighting for the dirt beneath his boots and the woman on the ladder. He leaned out and fired a controlled burst, forcing the lead guard to dive for cover behind a heavy storage crate. He thought about his kitchen on Navarra. He thought about the smell of the bread they had baked and the quiet peace of his herb garden. These men wanted to turn his sanctuary into a strip mine. They wanted to take the seeds of Navarra's future and put a price tag on them. He would not let that happen. Sterling moved forward, using the suppression fire from Harrison to close the distance. He did not want to kill if he could avoid it, but he would not hesitate to disable. He threw a flash crate toward the center of their line. The white light blinded the front row, and Sterling was on them before they could recover. He used the butt of his rifle to drop the first man and swept the legs of the second, moving with a fluid lethality that had been dormant for years. Up on the platform, Clementine reached the main console. The interface was a complex array of glowing glyphs and biometric scanners. She did not hesitate. She slammed the data drive into the port, and her fingers danced across the holographic keys. "Sterling, I need 90 seconds," she yelled down, her voice echoing in the crater. "The encryption is layered." "You have 60, Sterling replied. The sound of a heavy engine rumbled from the sky. A Vanguard gunship was descending into the crater, its floodlights cutting through the dust like twin blades of light. The situation had just shifted from a skirmish to a siege. "Harrison, get to the tower," Sterling ordered. "We cannot hold the ground anymore." Harrison did not argue. He fired one last volley and sprinted for the stairs. Sterling followed, his boots clanging on the metal grating as he ascended. He felt the heat of a pulse round pass inches from his shoulder, the air shimmering with the discharge. He reached the first landing and turned to provide cover for Harrison. On the top deck, Clementine was staring at a progress bar. It was moving at a crawl. The gunship hovered outside the glass-enclosed control room, its chin-mounted turret swiveling toward them. "They are going to fire," Bianca warned, her voice tight with alarm. Sterling reached the top and grabbed a heavy equipment locker, dragging it in front of the window with a grunt of exertion. "Get down," he commanded. Clementine did not move. She stayed at the console, her eyes fixed on the data stream. "If I leave now, the handshake fails. I have to stay." Sterling did not try to pull her away. He stood between her and the window, his large frame acting as a physical shield. He looked at her, seeing the absolute determination in her blue eyes. She was the protector of this world. The gunship opened fire. The glass shattered, raining down in 1,000 tiny shards. The locker took the brunt of the kinetic impact, but the force knocked Sterling back. He hit the floor hard, his ears ringing. He looked up to see Clementine still standing, her hands steady on the terminal even as dust and debris swirled around her. "Transmission at 80%, she whispered, more to herself than him. Sterling scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs. He picked up his rifle and aimed at the gunship's sensor array. He only needed to buy her a few more heartbeats. He breathed out, found the center of the lens in his sights and squeezed the trigger. The sensor shattered, and the gunship veered wildly as its guidance system glitched. "Done," Clementine cried out. "It is done." A low-frequency pulse rippled through the air, but it was not a sound. It was the feeling of 1 billion data packets being released into the planetary network. Every terminal on Navarra, every handheld device, and every orbital satellite suddenly received the same broadcast. The vault coordinates, the botanical logs, and the legal proof of the planet's indigenous rights were now public domain. It was an unmasking that no corporate lawyer could undo. The corporate guards below stopped firing. Their comlinks were likely buzzing with frantic orders from their superiors. The legal ground had just been cut out from under them. Vanguard no longer owned the secrets of Navarra. The people did. The gunship hovered for a moment, its pilot realizing the mission was a total failure. With a heavy roar of its thrusters, it turned and began to retreat toward the horizon, leaving a trail of black smoke against the morning sky. Sterling slumped against the console, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Clementine. She was covered in dust, her floral dress torn at the hem and her white fur messy, but she was smiling. "We did it," she said softly. Sterling reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You did it, Clementine. I just held the door open." Harrison walked over, leaning on his rifle and wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the two of them and shook his head. "You two are a disaster, but you are a very effective disaster." Bianca joined them, looking out over the crater at the rising sun. "It will take them weeks to sort out the legal fallout," she said, "but they cannot take it back now. Navarra belongs to its people." Sterling felt a strange sense of calm. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. He looked at the terminal, where the words broadcast complete glowed in steady green light. "Let us go home," Sterling said. Clementine took his hand, her grip firm and warm. "I think I would like that. But Sterling." He looked at her. "Yes." "I am still not making the soup tonight," she said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Sterling laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet of the control room. "Deal. I will handle the kitchen. You just keep drawing the maps." They began the long walk down the tower stairs. The air outside was crisp and clean, the dust finally settling. The corporate vehicles were already loading up, their lights fading as they retreated from the site. The battle for Vesper's Hollow was over, but the work of building a new world was just beginning. As they reached the bottom, Sterling looked back at the silver spire. It had once been a symbol of corporate control. Now it was a beacon. He felt a surge of pride, not for the combat he had seen, but for the life he was returning to. He had spent his career serving an empire, but he had found his soul in a small kitchen on a frontier world. They reached the rover, which was battered and smoking but still functional. Harrison climbed into the driver's seat while Bianca took the navigator's chair. Sterling helped Clementine into the back and sat down beside her, their shoulders touching. The drive back to Oakhaven was quiet. The landscape of Navarra seemed different now. The blue-leaf trees and the basalt ridges were part of a heritage they had fought to preserve. Sterling watched the sun climb higher, casting long shadows across the valley, and realized he was finally exactly where he was supposed to be. The rover bounced over the final basalt ridge, its suspension groaning under the weight of the day's exhaustion. Sterling kept his hand on the roll bar, his eyes scanning the horizon where the lights of Oakhaven began to twinkle against the darkening violet sky of Navarra. Beside him, Clementine held the data drive against her chest as if it were a living thing. Her white fur was matted with dust, and her floral dress was torn at the hem, but the look in her blue eyes was no longer one of fear. It was the look of a woman who had just redrawn the map of her own destiny. Harrison steered the vehicle toward the main gates of the settlement. Usually, the arrival of a battered rover would draw suspicious glares from the local militia, but tonight was different. As they approached the perimeter, people began to spill out of their prefabricated homes and stone cottages. They were holding portable tablets and projectors, the glow of the broadcast illuminating their faces in flickering shades of amber and blue. "They know," Bianca whispered from the navigator's seat. She leaned out the window, waving to a group of Leporan miners who were cheering and holding up their devices. "The whole planet knows." Sterling watched the crowd part for them. He saw the faces of the people he had served bread to, the neighbors who had once looked at him as a cold, distant soldier. Now, they looked at him with a silent, profound respect. He felt a lump in his throat that he hadn't experienced in 20 years of fleet service. This wasn't a victory for a flag or an emperor. It was a victory for the dirt beneath their boots and the seeds sleeping in the mountain. Harrison brought the rover to a halt in the central square. He killed the engine, and for a moment the only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal. Sterling hopped out and reached back to help Clementine down. Her hand was warm and steady in his. "You did it," Sterling said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "You gave them their home back." Clementine looked around at the gathered crowd. "We did it, Sterling. I just provided the coordinates. You provided the strength to reach them." A tall man in a worn colonial jacket pushed through the throng. It was Inspector Cale, the man who had audited them weeks ago. He didn't look like a bureaucrat tonight. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He held up a handheld comms unit that was still scrolling through the public data Clementine had released. "The Vanguard Group has already issued a formal withdrawal from this sector," Cale announced, his voice carrying across the square. "The legal weight of that seed vault has triggered an automatic environmental protection mandate from the Central Core Worlds. Navarra is no longer a corporate asset. It is a sovereign sanctuary." A roar went up from the crowd, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. People hugged one another, species labels forgotten in the shared joy of their survival. Bianca jumped into Harrison's arms, and for once the stoic soldier didn't pull away. He laughed, a deep and rare sound, and spun her around. Sterling felt a tug on his sleeve. Clementine was looking up at him, her long ears twitching with excitement. "Can we go home now?" she asked. "I think I've had enough of towers and gunships for one lifetime." Sterling smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Yes, let's go home." They left the celebration to the others and walked the familiar path toward the edge of the valley. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the sweet, peppery scent of night-blooming jasmine. When they reached Sterling's cottage, he paused at the gate. The smoke alarm was silent. The kitchen was dark. It looked exactly as it had when he was a lonely man waiting for the end of his days. But as he opened the door and flipped the light switch, the space was transformed by the presence of the woman walking in behind him. Clementine set the data drive on the wooden kitchen table. "This needs to go to the archives tomorrow," she said. "But tonight, it's just a piece of plastic." Sterling moved to the pantry. He felt a sudden, intense need to work with his hands, to create something that wasn't a weapon or a barricade. He pulled out a bag of flour and a jar of honey. He looked at the induction burner, the same one where Clementine had once nearly burned down her house. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I'm starving," she admitted, sliding into a chair. "But I don't want a military ration or a protein bar. I want something that tastes like Navarra." Sterling began to measure out the ingredients. His movements were fluid and precise, the result of decades of discipline, but there was a new softness to his touch. He wasn't just cooking to fill a stomach. He was cooking to anchor them both to this moment. Clementine watched him, her chin resting on her hands. "You know, when I first came to your door, I was terrified of you. You looked like you were made of flint and iron." Sterling didn't look up from the dough he was kneading. "I was. I had spent so long protecting things that I forgot how to enjoy them. I thought retirement was just a slow way to fade out." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think it's just the preparation for the main course," he said, glancing at her with a smirk. He set the dough to rise and turned to the stove. He began to prepare a simple glaze of local berries and silver thyme. The aroma filled the kitchen, a warm and comforting scent that seemed to push back the shadows of the conflict they had just escaped. Clementine stood up and walked over to him, standing close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her. "Sterling," she said softly. He set the spoon down and turned to face her. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the cooling stove. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the same vulnerability he had seen when she confessed her secret identity. But there was something else there now, a certainty. "I'm not going back to the Frost Belt," she said. "Even if my work as a cartographer takes me across the planet, this is where I want my maps to end." Sterling reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His fingers lingered against her skin. "I've spent my life following orders and moving from station to station. I'm tired of moving, Clementine. I'd like to stay right here." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "Then it's settled. We'll build something here, something that doesn't require a permit or an audit." Sterling pulled her into a gentle embrace. He felt the tension finally leave his shoulders, the weight of his past service dissolving in the warmth of her presence. He had been a chef for generals and kings, but as he held Clementine in his quiet kitchen on a frontier world, he knew he had finally found the only person he ever truly wanted to cook for. The timer on the oven chimed, a bright and cheerful sound. Sterling stepped back, though he kept one hand on her waist. "Duty calls," he joked. Clementine laughed and reached for an apron hanging on the wall. "Not just your duty, Sterling. You promised to teach me the fundamentals, remember? I think I'm ready for the advanced course." Sterling handed her a dusting of flour. "Then let's get to work, cartographer. We have a lot of lost time to make up for." They worked together in the small kitchen, their movements no longer clashing but flowing in a practiced rhythm. There were no more secrets between them, no more corporate threats, and no more fear of the future. There was only the flour, the honey, and the promise of a meal shared in the peace they had fought so hard to win. As the first batch of honey-glazed bread came out of the oven, the golden light of the kitchen spilled out into the dark Navaran night, a beacon of a different kind. It was a light that signaled not a warning, but a welcome home. The morning sun climbed over the jagged peaks of the Iron Range, casting long, amber shadows across the blue-leafed forests of Navarra. Sterling stood on the porch of his cottage, a mug of bitter black coffee in his hand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sweet, resinous perfume of the nearby pines. He watched a single silver hawk circle the valley, its wings catching the light as it patrolled the now silent skies. There were no corporate gunships today. There were no surveillance drones blinking in the distance. For the first time since he had hung up his military apron, the silence felt like a reward rather than a void. He leaned against the railing, feeling the smooth grain of the wood under his palm. Retirement had originally felt like a slow fade into irrelevance, a quiet ending to a life defined by loud orders and steaming mess halls. Now, it felt like a beginning. Harrison and Bianca arrived just as the dew began to lift from the grass. They did not come in a tactical rover this time. They walked up the winding path from Oakhaven, their expressions relaxed and their pace slow. Harrison carried a crate of fresh supplies from the market, while Bianca held a bundle of rolled parchment that looked like new geological surveys. "Is that the smell of actual peace, or did you finally learn how to make an omelet without burning the house down?" Harrison called out from the bottom of the steps. Sterling set his mug on the railing and smiled. "It is the smell of a kitchen that belongs to me again, Harrison. Come inside. The bread is still warm and the honey is fresh from the hives." They gathered around the heavy oak table in the center of the kitchen. Clementine was already there, her white fur groomed, and her blue eyes sparkling with a quiet intensity. She was laying out small bowls of honey and salted butter, her movements fluid and confident. When Sterling entered, she caught his eye and offered a small, knowing nod. The bond between them had solidified during the long hours of the siege, but in the morning light, it felt even more substantial. It was no longer forged in crisis, but in the simple, shared reality of a new day. "The Provisional Council signed the charter an hour ago," Bianca said, unrolling one of her maps across the corner of the table. "Vanguard is officially barred from the sector. The seed vault is under the protection of the local militia now. They are calling it the Sovereign Sanctuary of Navarra." Clementine traced the lines on the map with a slender finger. "It is more than a sanctuary, Bianca. It is a library of life. We spent the night cataloging the first 3 chambers. There are species in those vaults that have not been seen on the surface for 3 centuries. We can start the restoration of the northern plains by next season. We have the data to bring the entire ecosystem back into balance." Sterling leaned against the counter, watching them. He saw the way Harrison reached for a slice of bread, his movements devoid of the tension that usually defined him. He saw the way Bianca spoke of the future with a certainty that had been absent during their flight through the canyons. This was what victory looked like. It was not just the absence of an enemy. It was the presence of a plan. He thought about the years he had spent following maps drawn by men who only cared about territory. Now, he was looking at a map drawn by someone who cared about growth. "And what about you two?" Harrison asked, looking between Sterling and Clementine. "I do not see any packed bags. I do not see a retired colonel looking for a new war to fight." Sterling walked over to a small workbench near the window. He picked up an object wrapped in a soft linen cloth and turned it over in his hands. "I have had enough of the fleet, Harrison. I spent 20 years feeding soldiers so they could go out and destroy things. I think I would like to spend the rest of my time feeding people who are busy building things." He turned to Clementine. She looked up, her ears twitching in curiosity. Sterling unwrapped the cloth to reveal a hand-carved wooden spoon. It was made from the deep, reddish wood of a Navaran ironwood tree, polished until it shone like glass. The handle was etched with delicate patterns that mimicked the topographical lines of the valley they called home. "I made this morning," Sterling said, his voice low and steady. "I told you I would teach you the fundamentals, Clementine, but I think I am through being the teacher. I would rather we just be partners. This is for the kitchen we are going to run together." Clementine took the spoon, her fingers brushing against his. The weight of the wood seemed to ground her. She looked from the gift to Sterling, her expression softening into something profound and vulnerable. "A partner who knows his way around a kitchen is a rare find on the frontier," she said. "I accept the terms of this alliance, Sterling, as long as you do not mind if I still make a mess of the flour occasionally." Harrison let out a bark of laughter and raised his coffee mug. "To the chef and the cartographer, may they never lose their way and may their soup never burn." They spent the afternoon in the herb garden, working the soil together. Sterling showed Harrison where to plant the new silver thyme, while Bianca and Clementine discussed the irrigation needs of the vault seeds. There was a sense of purpose in the labor. Every stone they moved and every seed they planted was a declaration of ownership. They were not just inhabitants of Navarra anymore. They were its stewards. Sterling felt a deep sense of connection to the land that he had never felt on any starship. The soil of Navarra was not just dirt, it was a promise. As evening approached, the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The single moon rose, a pale pearl hanging over the silhouettes of the mountains. Harrison and Bianca eventually said their goodbyes, disappearing back down the trail toward the lights of Oakhaven. The settlement was glowing in the distance, a cluster of warm sparks against the dark expanse of the valley. Sterling and Clementine stood at the edge of the garden, the cool night air settling around them. The frantic pace of the last few weeks felt like a different lifetime. The fear, the chases, and the bureaucratic threats had faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic sound of the wind in the trees. "Do you think it will stay like this?" Clementine asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Sterling wrapped an arm around her, drawing her closer. "Nothing stays exactly the same," he said. "The seasons will change. New challenges will come. But we have the maps and we have the food. We have a vault full of life and a community that knows how to fight for it. I would say the odds are in our favor." Clementine smiled and looked up at the stars. "I used to spend all my time looking at the ground, trying to find where I fit on a map. I never realized that home is not a coordinate you find. It is something you make with someone else." Sterling kissed the top of her head, feeling a profound peace settle over him. "Then let us make it a good one," he whispered. They turned back toward the cottage together. The golden light from the kitchen windows spilled out onto the porch, inviting them back inside. There were no more battles to win and no more secrets to keep. There was only the warmth of the hearth, the promise of the next meal, and the quiet, enduring strength of two souls who had found their place in the vastness of the stars. As the door clicked shut, the the valley of Oakhaven remained still, a peaceful sanctuary under the watchful gaze of a single moon. The story of their struggle was over, but the story of their life on Navarra had only just begun.